Thank you very much. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. It's great to see everyone. I want to thank the Nguyen Society for their invitation to speak and to share a few thoughts on a topic that I think is vitally important for a lot of the conversation that we're having. A lot of the things I'll be saying is building on some of the things that we've heard before, but I'm absolutely thrilled also to be able to share the podium with my good friend and colleague, Tom Harmon here. So it's going to be a real treat for me as well. So since we don't have a lot of time, let's dive right into it. We speak a lot about the renewal of Catholic education, renewal of higher ed, and we talk a lot about fides et ratio, faith and reason, and rightfully so, that integration of faith and reason, like John Paul II said, faith and reason are two wings upon which the human spirit soar to the contemplation of truth. But I would submit that faith and reason has a third component that I think we really should focus on also, which is the vita part. And I always like to tell our students there's fides et ratio et vita, and the life aspect. Faith and reason are lived in a context. Faith and reason are lived in a community. Faith and reason are lived out. So I think the renewal of Catholic education that we've been talking about over the past couple of days is also dependent on not just a robust recovery and renewal of that integration of faith and reason, but also that integration and that living out in the vita component, which then has redounding consequences for things such as student life, student affairs, that aspect of a campus life. If I could put it another way, I mean, that's kind of the theoretical, but if I can put it in kind of a more gritty way, if an average student takes 15 credit hours, which is a full semester, if an average student takes 15 credit hours, and if by the common standards, there's 2 hours of study for every credit hour, that means every week, the fides et ratio part of it is about 45 hours a week. There's 168 hours in a week. What about the other 123 hours? That's where your student life people come in. That's where student affairs comes in. That's where that vita part comes in. And some people are like, well, you got to take out for sleeping and things like that. Well, yes, but they're sleeping in our dorms a lot of times. And sometimes they're woken up in the middle of the night. So the fides et ratio lives out even in the middle of the night when the fire alarm goes off. The fides et ratio lives out in the vita part of Friday night, Saturday night, Sunday morning, and all those things as well. So I think here, and again, statistic-wise, that means that whereas professors would have access to students over those 45 hours, student affairs would have access 4 times more than that. So the influence can and has a lot of potential for being quite a bit. Student affairs is what I'm defining very broadly today to encompass all of student life. And I would submit then that the renewal of Catholic education at the higher ed level is really tied in with that significant student affairs and student life renewal as well. It has to happen in that. The challenge that we find in our contemporary moment, I think, is that there's a key philosophical influence that has been influencing student affairs for quite a while. That key philosophical influence is critical theory. And that's why I chose to do my dissertation on that theme, because it was a fascinating connection that I had never really seen before, the influence of how critical theory plays out and has influence over the years. And so as I was digging into it, and of course, critical theory, you see it a lot in academic disciplines. I first came to it when in biblical studies, because you have the higher critical studies and things like that. You see that in classics. You see that in all kinds of different English. You see it in all kinds of different academic disciplines, but you also have the critical social theory, and that's what I want to focus on a little bit. And in the contemporary form of it, it's played out in all kinds of different ways. You have critical legal theory, which is also in law school, I ran into that, critical race theory, you have gender queer theory, you have all these different branches of it. So I wanted to start to trace to see what the root of this is. Where did this come from? How do we get here, in other words? The roots can all be traced back to this institute called the Institute for Social Research, otherwise known as the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School really shaped critical theory. And I would submit, just to cut to the chase, that this influence has really created the backdrop, what I call the attitudinal posture of student affairs and student life and the approach to how we do it. And I found that there's a correlative relationship. It's not a relationship that if you believe this, it's going to become this. If you believe this, it's going to act out, which is what I thought the relationship was. The relationship turned out to be more correlational. What do I mean by that? It gives a context. It gives a backdrop that if you default to it, it moves the activities into that way. So a lot of times, it's very good-hearted people. A lot of times, it's very good-hearted and well-meaning things. But because the desire to be neutral, because that backdrop has already been shaped for years and years by critical theory, the tendency is to default back to a critical theory approach. So critical theory, there's a little bit, let's look at the history a little bit, some of the main tenets, and then how student affairs came into that, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the implications that are there. So let's look at critical theory a little bit. Critical theory really is a broad social philosophy that came up. It focuses in on society, it focuses in on culture. Its purpose is wanting to reveal, to critique, and most importantly for them, to challenge what they see as perceived power structures. It's based on power structures and what's been perceived as power structures. Now, the really interesting thing about this is that one of the original proponents, a guy named Max Horkheimer. Max Horkheimer was part of this institute, and he wrote an essay in 1937 called Traditional and Critical Theory. In that essay, he laid out what he called traditional theory, and to him, traditional theory was actually the Enlightenment. So in traditional theory of the Enlightenment, we're using scientific things. So we're not talking traditional theory as in scholasticism or anything like that. We're talking traditional theory as Enlightenment scientism. He's rejecting that. They're saying, no, that's based on proofs, that's based on empiricism, that's based on all these things. And they're saying, no, we want to react against that. That's what critical, we want to criticize it, not just in what we would say critical thinking using logic. Actually, it's a kind of discarding of that. They wanted to challenge. They wanted to strip down. They wanted to go against. They wanted to blow it up, in other words. That's what Horkheimer saw as critical theory. And so this actually then developed within a Marxist intellectual milieu. So they took a lot of their cues from the Marxism that was going on then. But they distanced themselves also from Marxism because they thought Marxism spent too much time looking at the overarching thing as an economic base. So with Marx and Engels, that was more their look. We want to be critical, adopting kind of a Hegelian dialectics that's there, but we want to challenge the economic base. These guys said, no, we want to look at it in a cultural way. We want to look at it in a societal way. We want to look at it in a power-based way. So it's still Marxist, but it's not using economics as its basis. It's using culture. It's using social relationships and what it perceived to be, to be power. And so they formed in 1923 an institute called at the Goethe University in Frankfurt, Germany, the Institute for Social Research. And so their nickname for that was the Frankfurt School because it was there. So critical theory started to encompass all kinds of different thinkers. There's too many to look at right now, but the three main guys that for our purposes would be a guy named Max Horkheimer, another guy named Theodor Adorno, who was the polymath musicologist guy, and then Herbert Marcuse was the third one. You also had Jürgen Habermas, a guy named Habermas. Habermas actually just died a few months ago, March of this year. He was more like second generation of it, but it's fascinating, but not for our purposes right now. So what they wanted to do was they wanted to shift from that economic Marxist base analysis to a neo-Marxist social critical theory that's going on there. So the significance here, and just because there's parallel stories going on here, the significance is that in student affairs work, in student life work, is really engaging a cultural, institutional, developmental enterprise. And so this became, and we'll see where that link starts to come because it's kind of, it's a ripe, kind of a ripe area for that type of analysis. So what are the core tenets of critical theory? There's a lot of it, and it's diversified, and they even kind of hated each other sometime and argued with each other. So it made it really, really complex. You can go down a million rabbit holes. But I wanted to distill it down to three. The first one is they emphasized and looked at power dynamics and hegemony. power dynamics and hegemony. The second one is their methodology of dialectics. We'll look at some of these very quickly. And then the third one, and very importantly for some of the conversations that we're having, is that notion of liberation as well. So power dynamics and hegemony, dialectics, and liberation. So let's unpack some of this here. Power dynamics and hegemony is really interesting that when the war with Iran started, one of the reactions against the United States that I saw at a news conference was, this is the United States imposing a hegemonic war on us. And I thought, well, that's they're speaking critical theory language and bringing up with there. What is hegemony? So remember, critical theory likes to look at the power structure. They call that the status quo. So whenever you have a power structure that they perceived, they said that's the status quo. That is hegemony. The word hegemony came from an Italian Marxist named Antonio Gramsci. He died in the 30s. He said basically hegemony is when you impose your status quo on another group or another person in order to maintain your power base. Okay, that's the seed of it. And so the critical theorists at the Frankfurt School said, well, that's really good. So they adopted that into that analysis that they want to put onto culture, onto society, onto institutions, onto all kinds of structure. So Horkheimer and Adorno then got together in 1947, published a work called The Dialectic of Enlightenment. And so what they did was they critiqued what they saw as the culture industry. So they applied it to culture. Their way of looking at it is, oh, the culture, whatever that may be, whether it be writ large or whether it be within an institution, within a family, within whatever that is, that hegemony, that culture needs to be challenged. That culture industry then needs to be challenged. And really, really interesting, to me, it's like they got some of that right, but some of it not so right. On the one hand, they would be very critical of like a lot of the pop culture that we would have, bubblegum rock, things like that. They would say that's horrible. But on the other hand, they would look like institutions like the church or something like that and said that's also a hegemonic type approach to things. So then they moved to dialectics. What do you do about it then? For them, dialectics, coming from the Hegelian base there, the dialectics, their main tool is to challenge. Their main tool is not to reason. The main tool is not to argue, because that's the Enlightenment traditional theory that Horkheimer was rejecting. You got to clash. You got to go against it. So you can see where it's kind of neo-Marxist, because, yeah, it's revolution, but it's a revolution kind of a different way. And actually, they disagreed on whether or not it should become a literal revolution or not. Adorno would say, no, revolution is with theories and things like that. We clash with theories. Marcuse said, no, we got to take to the streets and go about it that way. So they wanted to blow things up. They wanted the clash. They wanted to disrupt that status quo, and they wanted to do what's called an immanent critique. An immanent critique is revealing from the inside what they saw hypocritical, inconsistent things within an institution, within an idea, within a culture. That then leads to liberation. For liberation, they take it very differently from what we would understand in Catholic social teaching as liberation. The danger of this also is the terminology can be used very, very differently. Some of this overlaps. I mean, we talk about the liberation, the freedom of a Christian, and things like that. They talk about liberation as freedom, the clash that allows you to move beyond the hegemony. That's there. Very different, but can sound very similar. Just to peek ahead a little bit, that's one of the challenges with student life and student affairs and college life, is that sometimes those terminologies can be used in one way where you have two people understanding it differently. And again, I would submit, because critical theory has really painted that attitudinal backdrop, when we use it, we may be thinking freedom in Jesus Christ, but a lot of folks who have maybe even non-consciously adopted the backdrop of critical theory, that's going to be liberation from the hegemony that's been oppressing you. Okay, so hold that in mind. At the same time, over on this strand here, you have, in the 20s and a little bit before, you have colleges. In the United States, colleges in the 1800s kind of adopted the English university models. And it became known as, in the profession, they call it the Oxbridge model, Oxford, Cambridge, and they put it together. So the Oxbridge model. In the Oxbridge model, which is kind of what, if you read Newman's idea of university, and particularly his Benedictine essays, you kind of get that backdrop in there as well. He was kind of writing from that tradition. The Oxbridge model, when students came, they studied within the community. Newman really didn't talk much about student affairs and things like that, because to him, there was already kind of this society that supported that. So if you're living in kind of a tutorial type things and what we would kind of call households and colleges and things like that, you kind of had that structure there already. So their emphasis became like the reason aspect. And so when I read Newman, sometimes I'm like, gosh, he's not really talking about student life much. It's in there, but because he didn't have to. That just wasn't the experience that was there. So the Oxbridge model, because you sent your kids and because that structure was there, your tutors, your professors became in loco parentis. They became where the parents should be. So the idea of early student affairs, if you will, was that we stand in the place of the parents, which means we make sure that they get to chapel. We make sure that they're being moral. We're making sure, so it's as if you were a parent. And that was the Oxbridge model that in the early 20th century, the American universities all adopted. But as you were going along, what started to happen was you started to get a diversification in the student body a little bit. It's easy to be in loco parentis if all of your students were male from a certain socioeconomic class with a society that supported that. It's a lot easier to be in loco parentis. But what if all of a sudden you get some women coming in? Well, we're going to need to have then, because I'm a male professor, we're going to need to get a dean of students, a dean of women, in order to, so that they started to hire on. So, okay, well, we'll take care of that, but you can be the dean of the women's students. So you need to oversee in loco parentis the women students and things like that. So the early development of student affairs was because of this diversification that started to come into the universities on there. As it started to go on and this became more and more developed, more people started to go to college, more diversification of students from different socioeconomic classes, things like that. There needed to be more student services that started to be offered. Up to 1937 then, the American Council of Education came out with a landmark report on what was going on. And they said, the student personnel point of view, hey, we're still looking at the whole student. So that language was still used, but we're going to need to formalize this other part of the university here that addresses the needs of the students outside of the classroom. That became the impetus, that became the seed for what we understand now that developed into student affairs. After World War II, more development came. This became known as the kind of the golden age of American higher education. You had the GI Bill, so you had this boom of other students coming into the university, and universities really became diversified, it really became bigger. And because of that, the response was that, hey, we need more student affairs professionals to address those types of things. But the interesting thing, and this is where our story really corresponds, is that right at that time, in the 60s and into the 70s, you have the dramatic social changes that were going on in the United States. And then you had a legal shift all of a sudden. That's when the cases started to come out recognizing 18-year-olds as adults. All of a sudden, the notion of in loco parentis really became odd to look at in that context, because no longer did you have an Oxbridge model and a support of that, but now you have laws that were saying, hey, 18-year-olds are adults. You can't make them go to chapel. You can't, this and this and this. So it really shifted the landscape a little bit. The results was that, well, student affairs now becomes kind of a supporting thing, not so much an in loco parentis thing, and we became more like, almost social work sometimes. They came to the problems, and things like that. At the same time in the church, you had that kind of push and pull and tug of war of the understanding of Catholic social teaching and things like that that was going on. Into this very tense mix came Herbert Marcuse. Marcuse was one of the original Frankfurt School guys. He started to teach, particularly in the United States or so. He became known as the father of the New Left. Marcuse, remember, Adorno wanted the clash, the dialectics, to be more ideas and intellectual and argumentation, those types of things. Marcuse said, no, we need to take it to the streets. And through Marcuse's influence, he popularized these dialectical, hegemonic ideas and things like that, particularly on college campuses. As a matter of fact, the result of that was a lot of these things that we see in documentaries and things like that in the 60s. Those student protests were very much inspired by Marcuse. Now, he wasn't the only one, but his ideas really were driving this. For example, in 1968, April of 1968, the famous student protest at Columbia University. If you look up the protest there, that was one of the major ones in 1968. They explicitly, when they were organizing it and talking about it, explicitly said, we are inspired by the books and articles of Marcuse. Those ideas drove them to the streets to do this violent kind of protest and things like that. 1 month later, in May of 1968, over in France, the riots at the University of Paris and Nanterre, which then became kind of the big student riots in France. That was like the student riots in France that almost toppled de Gaulle's government there, was also inspired by Marcuse. They cited Marcuse at that. And then UC San Diego in fall of that year, 1968, where Marcuse said, yeah, in order to do that, we have to set up war zones. And so students and other protesters went, set up war zones in the University of San Diego. Then Governor Ronald Reagan tried to order Marcuse to be fired because he was teaching at San Diego at that time. That later became known as kind of the Occupy movement. That was really kind of just a revitalization later on during the COVID years and things like that of Marcuse's war zone that he was doing back in the University of San Diego way back in 68. So Marcuse started to have this increasing influence on student affairs, because here you have this shifting student affairs profession that was going on. All the protests of the 60s, the critical theory aspect, it started to spill into the student affairs realm. So student affairs, the National Association of Student Personnel Administrators, the NASPA, very famous organization still around, as well as the American College Personnel Association, ACPA, both came out with different position papers and things like that, pretty explicitly adopting critical theory in as kind of an MO to do it. So where's the current state of student affairs theories now? And that kind of continued all the way through the 80s, the 90s, and then into today. Right now, we're experiencing what we're calling the third wave student affairs practitioners and theorists. The third wave, because the first wave was the Oxbridge model. Second was the Marcuse influence, and then third wave now, these third wave one, they're emphasizing very much that student affairs is a practice-oriented profession. And so what the term that's properly used is praxis. So you have practice, which is just things that you do, how you do certain things, but you have praxis. To them, they define praxis as actions that put into effect what you believe, your philosophy. That's a praxis. And so they say student affairs is not just things that you do. It's not just, methodologies and tools. Student affairs is very much a praxis-oriented profession, a praxis-oriented endeavor. And so this third wave group of scholars, Elisa Alba is one, Susan Jones, D.L. Stewart, in 2019 came out with a very popular publication, a monograph, a book, entitled Rethinking College Student Development Theory Using Critical Frameworks. So they are calling for not just a backdrop of critical theory, they're calling for an explicit praxis of critical theory into student affairs practices. So it's a much more blatant, it's a much more clearly curated, if you will. And one of the things that they said as the goal of that, why is that? Is because at this moment in history, we need to even more seriously reveal the uncovering of these types of power structures. It's the same argument again, so that we can implement the praxis of liberatory practices, so that we can free our students from the things that have held them back. And then from there, you go into the different critical theories, whether it be their race has held them back, their socioeconomic, their religion, their gender identity, whatever that may be. That all comes from that same root there of critical theory. And so now they've even explicitly went back and called for, and more acutely, the notion of praxis as understood by Paulo Freire. For those of you who've studied education, Freire was the Brazilian one that wrote Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Had a huge influence on education. As a matter of fact, even in Catholic education, had a huge influence. A lot of schools are, and this is what my wife had done some research on this. She said, do you know if you go on the internet and you look up Freire schools, a lot of Catholic schools come up that very proudly put themselves out as Freire schools, which is explicitly implementing these neo-Marxist critical theory type practices that they're proud of, that they're doing that. This is the third wave student affairs theorists that's going on right now. The argument here, and I'll wrap up here and I'll let my good colleague go. The argument here is that I don't think student affairs practices are neutral. I do agree that it is a praxis-oriented thing. If we look at student affairs practices and we think that it's just that it can be neutral, I think we're going to get in trouble because critical theory has so formed to the backdrop that if you go neutral, it's going to start defaulting back and leaning towards that. Again, it's not a one-to-one. If we go and try to prove a one-to-one, we're going to get very frustrated. And so in my research, what we did was we implemented a what's called a Spearman-Rowe statistical test. I don't want to get all nerdy about the statistical tests here, but the Spearman-Rowe tests the strength of correlation as opposed to a one-to-one. So you're looking at covariables as opposed to causation. You know, my Thomistic brain always wants to say, hey, if we find X, we're going to find a result of Y. It's a causation thing. This is not that type of analysis. It's X and Y are co-equal variables. They're two variables, not a causative one. But if you have the presence of one, what's the strength of having the other as well? Not causative, but the strength of the relationship that's there. When I did my research with the quantitative side, when I applied the Spearman's Rowe, it came out as not only correlation, but strong, significant correlation, which means that in more popular, unscientific terms, if you got a backdrop of critical theory, it's going to result in the presence of praxis that leans towards this type of philosophy that's going on. And the surprising thing also is because I did my research not just with public institutions, but also with private institutions, even Newman Guide schools, that correlation was also found on there. So if I can just have one more minute here, Tom, just three very quick implications that I want to draw from this. What do we do with this? I would suggest three things. Number one is that when we're talking about student affairs, student services, in any of those manifestations of it, there is a huge need for an intentionality then. If the correlation is there, if neutrality means the correlation is going to tilt towards that, the most important thing and the first thing we have to do is be intentional about it. So the intentionality goes across the board when we're hiring. We have to be intentional about getting somebody who not only understands this or is at least open to understanding this, because if not, the neutrality is going to tilt towards a critical theory praxis of some sort. The intentionality takes away that neutrality and that correlation that's there. Two, I think institutional implications are there. If the default is critical theory and attitudinal postures and understanding, that means in our policy decisions, in practice and praxis decisions, in resource decisions, that intentionality has to be there as well. So policy is going to be really important, resource allocation, budgeting, that's all going to be very important. And of course, practices, what do we do, is going to be really important. Because if we just do something we think is neutral, it's going to tilt back that way. Dialectical resistance is not intentional, but the other thing that just as a quick footnote also, the current political situation has made it really interesting. Wasn't that big of a deal when I started my research, but you know, with the change in administration and all that, and the defunding of a lot of the DEI programs and those types of things, what I found in my qualitative research, which is interviewing a lot of the student affairs professionals, what I found is that the shift has just been done. In other words, a lot of these particular public institutions, people that I talk to, they're like, oh yeah, our DEI office is defunded. But they said, but we're just doing the same thing and better, shifting it somewhere else. So to a person at these institutions, not only are DEI programs still going on, they're going on very effectively under a different guise, and they all know it. So right now it's just under the radar. So in other words, there's a myth that, we've taken care of that. It's still there and quite strong. It's just being very creative and has shifted over a little bit. Third implication, and I'll end with this, is the theory to praxis correlation. And we were having a conversation with this at our student affairs group earlier when we were talking with Kim and Linda, is that right now there are not many, if at all, any student affairs academic programs for professional development. There's no place that you can go Newman Guide-wise and get a degree in student affairs or in education that has a student affairs track or something like that. You have a little bit here and there, but a fully developed program like that simply doesn't exist. The other thing that's very few and far between is those continuing professional development that needs to be there. At our discussion group, we were asked, what's the most pressing need right now, or one of the things that we see, we said the pipeline. There's not a pipeline for us to be able to have people that we can turn to, that we can hire at our institutions that would be able to carry this out and understand that. We'd have to either start from scratch or take a little bit of roll of the dice with somebody who is at least is neutral, but we knew the neutrality is going to tilt towards the implication there. So if there's one thing that I would like to call for, that perhaps Newman Guide School can get together and be creative about this and see, is to see if there's a way that we can get some sort of formalization, some sort of training, both initially, credential-wise, degrees-wise, but also in professional development, so that we can start that renewal in student affairs. So, thank you very much.
Ben and I really didn't plan this. We didn't know that. I don't think I knew that you were going to give a talk here, and not only that, but we didn't know we were going to be on the same panel. We are friends, so I guess it's not too surprising that our talks mesh pretty well, but they do. It wasn't planned; it was providential. So, just at the outset, I want to say thank you to the Cardinal Newman Society. Way back when, 26 years ago, I interned at the Cardinal Newman Society. It was before the the Newman Guide and all that stuff. So I owe a good deal to Patrick, and so I'm very grateful that I'm able to talk here now. Just before I get into my talk proper, though, I want to point out some of the nice convergences between my topic and Ben's. So what he's talking about is really what we see everywhere as a kind of acid wash for institutions. The problem with critical social theory is that there's no limiting principle. So if it destroys one hegemony, it's just going to be looking for another one then, and there's nowhere to stop. And so it's just a constant destructive force. And it's nihilism. I mean, Marcuse is basically Marx plus Nietzsche. Okay? And that is, I think, to connect to another talk that at least some of us in the room heard from last night, that's one of the problems with what General Brady was talking about last night. He was saying that we need to present an America that is lovable. Okay? Well, what does critical social theory do other than undermine someone's love for something that they ought to be able to love, okay, like their country? So I don't think anyone in here is naive enough to think that America is totally innocent of all wrongdoing, okay? This is a Catholic conference. The Church in the United States has had, at some points in our history, a rough go with the American nation. But it's also world historically been a pretty friendly place as well. And Catholic communities have thrived in America. And we've been able to take on positions of leadership in America and really contributed a great deal throughout the history of our country. Not so much in the beginning, but certainly as waves of Catholics arrived throughout our history. And I would say that we've even been able to contribute some very important things recently in our country's intellectual life. The very Catholic-coded, at least, theories of natural law that now hold sway on our Supreme Court have a long tradition, not just in the Catholic intellectual tradition, of course, but that's where it started. And so Catholics have had an enormous influence for the good in many different areas in the country, including in intellectual areas. So that's kind of the backdrop for my talk. We just, at the University of St. Thomas, were awarded a $1 million grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. And the grant is called Educating for Liberty. If any of you have been associated with the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, it was sort of inspired by ISI's motto. But the idea is to take a Catholic school, okay, and to try to figure out what are the ways in which we can present America as something lovable. Okay? And so what we're trying to do is to work with our students' affections. Okay, all right. Now, I'm an Augustinian theologian, so none of you are surprised at all to hear me talking about love. All right? And but some of you might be surprised with that knowledge to hear me talk about civics. Okay, so I did want to say that it's a weird thing in some ways, and in some ways, both in our recent past as Catholics, but also historically all the way back to the Roman Empire, the church has had a mixed relationship with the state, okay? And it's weird every once in a while when things start going kind of well. And I do think that I'm not immune from this, the identification of hegemonies also. As a matter of fact, Augustine was ahead of Horkheimer and Adorno in some ways. But obviously on very different bases. Augustine was no nihilist, okay? And Catholics aren't nihilists. Our critiques, when we give them, do have limiting factors because actually we know that the political community as a comprehensive human community allows us to express our abstract natures in the particular, okay? So we are parts of various types of communities, okay? Families, churches, okay? But also nowadays nations, okay? And the nation provides, in earthly terms, the widest possible arena for human action and thought, as a matter of fact. Okay? And so the nation, or some other political form, the nation is just the one we have access to now, is what allows us to express our natures in the concrete, in particular actions, by producing a common good and acting for it. Okay? And without that arena, our ability to express our natures is actually stunted. Okay, we struggle to live out our humanity. Okay, without that political arena. Okay, and so the political is something that is very important for Catholics to take account of. I think it falls under the commandment of our Lord to love our neighbors. Okay, how do you love your neighbor? Well, you love your neighbor in the concrete, not in the abstract. You don't love the humanity of your neighbor, you love your neighbor. Okay, and who's your neighbor? Well, he's the person who's living next to you. I'm pretty sure most of us, probably all of us in here, live in the United States of America. And so one of the most important things about your neighbor is that they're Americans. Okay? And if they're going to flourish, their flourish is going to be in an American type of flourishing. Okay, I have as much longing as the rest of you for Christendom, but we don't live in Christendom. Okay, and it's unlikely that we're going to get it back, as a matter of fact. And so the way that we flourish is going to be as expressed concretely in the particular in our present circumstances that are available to us. Okay? And so for Catholics to genuinely love their neighbors, they've got to pay attention to the health of the political community. Okay? All right, so it's with that in mind that I decided when the theme was announced for the NEH which was Celebrate America, exclamation point, that we should also celebrate America. And we're doing it in a way that is sort of idiosyncratic, I guess. There's lots of grants that we're given, and we're going to be fulfilling a grant that looks a little bit different from the rest of them that we're given in some ways. Okay. Now, there's also a broader movement in the United States that's dedicated to the revival of civics. You may have heard of some of these new civics institutes at even public universities. Okay. And the same grant program that I applied for ended up giving out lots of grants to these institutes as well. Okay. Now, how is it that a Catholic institution is going to live out this grant? Well, it's going to be a little bit different than University of Texas at Austin or Arizona State or UNC Chapel Hill. Okay. Now, I've got a pretty broad understanding of what civics means. Okay. So to be an American means more than just understanding and living according to procedures of democracy. Okay. And to be an American, to me, and this is what I wrote in the grant proposal, is to be the inheritor of a very long tradition. Okay? And first of all, an American tradition, and that's going to be important for the grants. But second of all, the longer Western tradition. Okay? The American story is a story that's embedded in the longer civilizational story of the West. Okay, and it's very consciously embedded in that story. All of our founders were educated by reading from the Bible, from the Church Fathers, from the Romans, from the Scholastics, and from that early modern constitutional tradition. Okay, so to take into account all of those factors is really to inherit the intellectual and institutional heritage of America. Okay? And so many of those institutions, of course, were developed in the course of a fruitful interplay among all of those factors. Okay? And quite intentionally. Okay? The Founding Fathers were well aware of all of those factors and trying to put them together. Okay? And so my argument to the NEH was, who's in better position to do this than a Catholic school? Okay? We've got access to the whole range of that tradition, as a matter of fact. And it's true that in the beginning we were a tiny bit outside of the mainstream. Okay? But over the course of time, even that has lessened a great deal. Okay? Now, again, so civics is often sort of reduced to the mechanics or the machinery of government. And so I do think that the opportunity here for Catholics, if they want to take part in this wider movement in America, is to have this wider and broader view of what civics and civics education is. Okay? Now, obviously, also for us, this work requires pretty careful judgment. Okay? Obviously, the American settlement did not arise as a Catholic political achievement. Okay? Its principles and habits and inherited compromises do need our discernment still. Okay? And obviously, again, just to reemphasize, our history has been marked by some tensions in America as well, and I don't want to underplay those. Okay? But our students want to love their country. Okay? Now, obviously, critical social theory isn't just confined to student affairs. It's also affected in a deep way the curriculum that most of our students take. Okay? And so they're somewhat detached from their country, as a matter of fact. That's kind of the default position of most people coming out of our school system, is to be detached from the thing that they should be attached to. Okay? And so this is actually a problem for the living out of their faith. Okay? Because they owe a debt of piety to their country, okay, actually. Okay, so there's an injustice here. Okay? But it's hard to blame them when they've mostly been presented with their country as hateful, okay, as systemically oppressive, as founded on evil. Okay? Now, it's important not to downplay the flaws that were there in the beginning, okay? But to present those as the most significant things about their country. Okay, that's the thing that's a disservice and an injustice. Okay, okay, now, just got a couple minutes left, so I want to tell you what we're actually doing in the grant. I know that many of you are actually involved in the work of Catholic education and even administration. And so there are 5 kind of legs of the grant. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to expand our honors program. Okay, the chairman of the NEH was really enthusiastic about our honors program. It's a great books program. It's grounded in the great texts of Western civilization, and he thought that was itself enough to qualify as celebrating America. Okay, we're going to run a public humanities program dedicated to highlighting the role of faith and the liberal arts at the founding. Okay. And of course, it will not just be at the founding, but it will show how that inheritance continues and grows throughout our history, and especially highlight the work of Catholic contributions along the way. Okay. Third, we're going to, this is the weirdest one probably, and the one that I thought I was going to have the hardest time making a case for. Fortunately, artificial intelligence was also a priority of this administration. So we're going to have a grant-funded program called AI, the Human Person, and Thomism. So we've got a doctorate that we offer in philosophy through our Center for Thomistic Studies. And my case to the NEH was that a very important voice in the conversation about what artificial intelligence is from Thomas Aquinas. And it's one that's largely missing for understandable reasons, I guess, from the present conversation. But it's one that is particularly well suited to figuring out what artificial intelligence is and how it can be used in a pro-human way. Okay, and that's I actually think that the civic case for that is pretty obvious. So, and they agreed. Fourth, we're going to have a survey run by one of our sociologists who is going to figure out what the status among the Gen Z students that we have is of their love of country. Okay, and what are the factors that lead them either to love their country or otherwise. Okay, and so the case was very simple there too. If you want to give people the opportunity to love their country, you've got to figure out what their baseline is. All right, and then we're also going to integrate civics education into our core curriculum as well. Okay, so those are the 5 legs, and so I've given you kind of like the framework of my case to the NEH. Again, like it's weird that there are people at the NEH now who are interested. That's never been the case as far as I've been an academic for the last 15 years or whatever. But it is now, so strike while the iron is hot, I guess. So anyway, that's my case. So hopefully, if you're thinking along the same lines, you'll be able to take advantage of these opportunities as well. So thank you very much.